Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and my goal is to help members of the military thrive in their post-service career and life. Today's episode number 460 with Michael Miur. For listeners, I want to give some quick background on this conversation. Michael and I connected a couple weeks ago via LinkedIn, and we had a quick conversation. Really was intrigued to learn more about his background for a couple of reasons, but I'll give you some of the highlights from what I've gleaned online. Michael served in the Marine Corps for about 4 years. He went to Brown University. He spent 2 years at Bain and Company as an associate consultant. Currently, he's at Silicon Valley Bank as an associate of corporate strategy. He's had internships at companies including Google, HBO, Deloitte, and Bain, and just a really incredible story that we'll kind of get into. But first of all, Michael, welcome to Beyond the Uniform.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
So first thing I wanted to just kind of dig into, to the degree to which you're comfortable talking about it on a podcast, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your background growing up, because it's very different than my experience growing up. I imagine it's very different than many of our listeners.
Yeah. So I get this question a lot, and I'm happy to jump into it. So I'm originally from Wisconsin, southeast Wisconsin, a town called Kenosha, which is about, it's on the eastern lakefront, or the east side of the state on Lake Michigan, between Chicago, Illinois, and Milwaukee. And I think Kenosha is interesting because it represents a huge swath of the country, what I would call like the Rust Belt, right? From let's say Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, through the Ohio Valley, Gary, Indiana, Chicago, Illinois, up through Wisconsin, and that whole part of the country was just a very heavily. It was an industrial powerhouse, right, for decades, and then this thing called globalization happened. And for many of us in Kenosha, the powerhouse, sort of the driver of the economy, was the automobile manufacturing industry. And in the late 80s, early 90s, that sort of went away. And all of a sudden, the city lost its identity. And I think when you strip away the number one driver of the economy, practically overnight, all the bad things sort of ensue, right? You get this shrinking tax base, which leaves social services underfunded, and then you get the follow-on sort of effects, namely unemployment, people just leaving in droves. The people who can, the people who stay behind, sort of fall into this trap of substance abuse, alcoholic, and drug addiction, crime, and just like a lost identity. And that's sort of enter Michael Miur. That's where I grew up. I was born there in 1991. And again, sort of on the tail end of the economy slipping away. And I had I was just born into a rough situation. My mother was married before she had me. Had 4 kids. The marriage was on the rocks. She met my father, and they hit it off, and eventually my mother got divorced, had me, but simultaneously slipped into substance abuse, and things fell to shambles almost right away. And that's what I was born into, which was my mother was an alcoholic and a drug addict. My first couple of years, I was in a group home for kids while both my parents were in prison off and on. And then when my mom sort of reclaimed custody of me, we bounced around the city of Kenosha and to a certain extent Racine, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But we're homeless for many years. Rarely sort of had a roof over our heads. And it was all because of my mother's addiction. And so, the environment growing up, first formative years of my life, was scary, right? That's some of the earliest emotions that I can remember is fear, and loneliness, and being very sad and scared. Again, lots of violence, lots of substance abuse, lots of uncertainty of where I was going to sleep, where I was going to eat. And so that lasted for years, until I was essentially taken away from my mother by the state. I ended up being placed into the foster care system, and then bounced around for a few years, different foster families, throughout the state of Wisconsin. And when I was 14, I was actually adopted by a young couple, and they also adopted 7 other kids. And kind of a crazy story, those 7 kids are biologically related. They all came from the same mom and dad. I was the oldest, and sort of not, part of, not of the same biological parents as them, but talk about just crazy, a house. My adoptive parents, God bless their soul, they were 30 some years old, and went from 0 kids to 8 in a matter of 2 years or something like that. Wow. So yeah, I'll pause there. I think that sort of sums up the journey, wave cap journey, from years 0 through 18 or so. Happy to answer any questions and double click into any of those, into that chapter.
I appreciate it. It's so wild. I'm just curious, in that environment, especially with the homelessness period.
Yeah.
Was there a sense of, because I'm trying to put myself at that age, was there a sense of like, this is not typical, or was that just the expectation of this is what life is like? Was there shame about that? Was there, or was that just kind of like, this is what life must be like?
Yeah, really good question. It was not an acceptance of this is what life must be like. And I think because I'm a human being that's able to, analyze my surroundings. I did go to school. I think I went to like 11 different schools before I even graduated high school. So I saw what other kids' lives were like. And I mentioned that my mother was married before she had me. And I'm still to this day close to my older siblings. We're half siblings, right? We have the same moms, but their dad is a different dad. And whenever we weren't sleeping on the streets, I would, get to go to their house. My mom and her first husband had this weird relationship. She was, still part of the kids' lives off and on. But I would get to go to their house and see what I wouldn't even call it normal, right? They were living in a divorced single father home, but at least it was safe and not quite the same circumstance that I had. So to answer your question, I knew it wasn't normal. And then, going to school again, being the kid who wore the same clothes every day, who clearly had clothes from the thrift store. Right. These things, kids are so observant, right? I certainly knew and understood that my experience was not normal. So yeah.
What was your experience with the foster system? I feel like sometimes all I know of that is what I see in movies, which either predicts, my experience is it either portrays it as this unbelievable catastrophe that is rampant abuse, or it's this halo effect of these angels who are rescuing these kids. And I imagine neither of those are really truly representative. But what was kind of your overall experience with the foster system?
Yeah, so the foster care system is interesting because it can span that sort of spectrum that you just highlighted, and I like to think that I could definitively say I've experienced both sides of that spectrum and everything in between. And when I say the foster care system, it doesn't just include foster homes, but it also includes group homes, which are, sort of an in-between when your parent maybe gets sent to jail and the system isn't ready to place you, or maybe it's a short-term stay in jail. You'll stay in a group home, which is essentially like a modern day orphanage, except most of the parents aren't deceased. They're just out of the picture temporarily. And so I've stayed at a number of those group homes. And then there's also this idea of respite care, which is you're a foster child who is placed in a home, but for whatever reason, temporarily you leave that home and go to another foster home for a week or two. And so going back to your question, what was it like? I've been in a home where it's very, maybe corrupt is the right word, where it was a single mom, who a foster mom, who essentially was in it for the money. It was very clear that she was not distributing any of those state funds to the kids in the form of clothing or food. And it was very abusive, right? She was physically abusive to some of the kids. So I've been in that situation, but then I've also been in situations where it was, man, this is a great family. I wish I could stay here forever, and for whatever reason I couldn't. And then in between is anything from upstate Wisconsin, in the middle of nowhere type of town, where I'm the only person of color in X amount of square radius, or uber religious families that I grew up going to church. My mom and I often went to church. If anything, it was a reprieve from the elements. But finding myself in this super uber religious family, where my first Sunday, again, probably the only Black kid in the entire church, and they're singing, praying in tongues on the way to church, completely foreign to me, right? So the foster care system really is a unique experience in that it can be so wide ranging, geographically, economically speaking, and I would say a lot of it's probably also a factor of your own personal identity, right? I already mentioned a couple of times being a young Black kid, a male in particular, very different experience depending on what home I was placed in at any given time. So it's a bad, it's not a fun experience. And the whole while you're missing your parents or your parent. My mother is messed up as her life was. That was my mom, and I was super defensive about her, and I would much rather, to the point where I'd rather live with her and live on the streets than to live in a foster care system. And so it was a rough journey, especially when you talk about moving consistently or constantly. Probably a year, say, was the longest duration. And, you sort of put all your belongings in a plastic bag, a garbage bag, and a social worker drops you off somewhere else. Very interesting upbringing, and not to focus just on the negative side. On the positive side, I think it builds a certain amount of resilience, right? To be able to pack up your stuff and immediately put yourself in a new environment, in an intimate environment, right? Somebody's home, that may or may not have kids of their own, and sort of being able to go with the flow, go with the punches, experiencing new schools, really, pretty consistently. Very interesting environment, for sure. Informative, for better or worse.
Was there, again, I feel like so much of what I draw on is movies or books, and like in a movie or a book, there's some moment where you make a commitment of, never again, or you decide I'm not, I'm going to get out of this. Like it was your experience that I'm wondering, like, because I also think of people who grow up with an example where their father's a lawyer, and they're like, oh, I will one day become a father, like a lawyer. And so like they see that role model and they choose that for whatever reason. So I'm kind of curious, do you see a moment in your life that was this defining moment of making a decision, or was it not that clean cut?
I think one of the biggest life lessons that I've ever learned, and that still guides me to this day, really was grounded in the fact of something to the tune of what you just said, never again. For me, it was this idea of, I might not know what I want to do or want to be, or what good looks like to me, but I have a huge array of experiences that tell me what I don't want. And so it was sort of living by this, I guess, like a negative experience in the fact, or the opposite experience, right? I got to come up with a better term to call this, but it was everything that I saw and lived. I remember thinking, if I do survive, I'm not going to put myself in this position. And I think I was also really attracted to the idea of personal accountability, because I could never understand why my mother, for example, would time and time again just make really, really bad decisions. And obviously I was naive to the idea of addiction and the disease that it is. But it seems so easy to me. And that's where the frustration would come. Like, why are you making this decision again and again and again? And so, yeah, I think my underlying philosophy is, as soon as I'm old enough, I'm getting out of here. Yeah. And I'm not going to live my life this way. Again, I don't know how I'm going to live it, but that was the mentality. And applying that to my life today has also proved to be very fruitful. And it's a really simple but powerful framework, right? To particularly if I've always been like a generalist, a jack of all trades, a master of none, right? I'm even throughout undergraduate years, even my time in the Marine Corps as a combat engineer, and we sort of do it all. And as a consultant, we're literally generalists. A lot of I bring that up because it's I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but again, I'm able to shut off huge swaths of industries or titles or what have you by just saying, well, I know I don't want that. Yeah. And it really all started as I based off my childhood.
It's crazy too, because I think of, as you were describing, one family who's very religious. It's almost like the story that I have is growing up. You had so much exposure to so many different things. It was almost like a chance to say, well, I don't want any of that, or I don't want that. It's just insane. What was the transition to the Marine Corps? Had there been someone in your life who was in the military? Was it something you'd seen on TV? Did you just meet a recruiter? Like, what led to that big step?
Yeah. So I did have somebody in my life that was in the military. My mother's father, my grandpa Jack was his name. He was in Army Air Corps before the Air Force was even a branch, but he was a vet of World War II. And he actually was part of the flight crew that flew a plane 30 minutes before the Enola Gay. It was a weather reconnaissance plane called the Straight Flush. And they performed the weather reconnaissance 30 minutes before the A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And so that sort of history was something that I always appreciated, and I looked up to my grandpa Jack a lot. But more, I think, a couple of other things, because it wasn't just from foster care to the Marine Corps. So there was the presence of my grandpa Jack, who also was a symbol of steadiness or steadfastness, and he was very much not happy with his daughter's decisions, right, to see us living on the street. So when I got to go to Grandpa Jack's house, it was a treat, because again, it was stability, it was safeness. But also, I think the idea of joining the military, if you're an American male that grew up in the post 9/11 era, I think I would argue that almost every young male in this country, whether or not this is a serious thought, I think they have thought about the idea of the military as an avenue for the life. We were surrounded by it in every way, shape, or form. Again, this is from our particular generation, what I would call like the millennial. Let's call it folks born in 1981 through 2005 or something like that, or maybe even later, 2011. I'd say like in that 30-year period, if you were a male that grew up in America, the idea of the military was not this crazy foreign subject. You're just surrounded by it. And so that also was in the back of my mind, right? Growing up, and it's as silly as it sounds, but playing video games that are, based off the military, or any movie that came out post 9/11, or, being bombarded with current events and news, right? Just growing up in this era, I think the idea of the military was always in the back of my mind. In fact, when I was in high school, and I had somehow done well enough to get a couple of scholarships, academic scholarships. When I was in high school, I had was working on getting a letter to go to West Point, for example, from my state senator, and that was like a pretty interesting experience. And at the last minute, I got a full ride scholarship to the University of Wisconsin, which was the dream school. If you're in Wisconsin, that's where, if you made it, that's where you went, was UW. And so I graduated high school. packed my bags, went 2 hours away to University of Wisconsin. And I ended up dropping out my first semester. I hated school. I think there were a number of factors going on. Part of it was I was still grappling with my, quite frankly, just really terrible childhood. And I didn't feel like I had gotten away from it, really. I was still, close to my hometown. In fact, I was still seeing a lot of the same faces on campus that I went to high school or middle school with. And so, I made the decision to withdraw and pack my bags. And my adoptive parents were like, "Are you crazy? You got a full ride scholarship. Are you sure you want to do this?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I want to move to California." And I had never even been to California, but I just wanted to go. I wanted to go west towards the direction of the sunset. It was one of these things that was just always in my mind. So I did that, left school, packed up my bags. I saved up money for that throughout that winter and spring of what would have been my freshman year. Worked a couple of odd jobs, and then got in a U-Haul in June and packed my bags and moved to San Diego. Again, I had never even been to San Diego, but ended up there. And if you know anything about the military, San Diego is a pretty big military town. And so I lived there for a couple of years, and I was surrounded by veterans or active duty personnel, and I was out meeting people and really exploring the area. And time again, the idea of the military would just sort of present itself in front of me. And so I decided to do some more research. And I'm one of these people that just goes down the rabbit hole. If I'm doing something on the internet, before you know it, I have 50 tabs open, and 49 of those 50 tabs were all about the Marine Corps of all the branches. Like, this is the one that I want. And I walked into a recruiter's office in San Diego and said, "I want to be a Marine." And they gave me the ASVAB, that aptitude test. And not to toot my own horn, but I crushed it. I got a 99 the first time I took it, and the recruiter thought I cheated. And it's funny because he became like a mentor of mine, but he made me go back and take it again. And I think I got a 95. And he's like, "Okay, you're serious." And then he actually asked me, he said, "Why are you so, I've never seen you before. And within the first, day of meeting you, you take this ASVAB and you say, 'Yeah, sign me up.' Usually when we have people that come in here like this, they're running from something." And so they thought maybe I was running from some legal issues, running from the law, which I was not. But I'll always remember that, because I wanted my initial response like, "No, this is really what I want to do." But looking back on it, it did seem like I was running away from, again, the circumstances of my birth, my childhood. And I wanted more, and I wanted better. And I saw the Marine Corps as a challenge. I saw it as an outlet for aggression that I had, and anger. I wanted to go fight. But I also saw it as a means for upward mobility, right? Especially once I got close to my recruiter in particular, and saw that he was married and had a successful marriage and things like that. It was very appealing. And so, the rest is history. I enlisted in 2011 out of San Diego, went to boot camp on the West Coast in San Diego in Camp Pendleton, and did the Marine Corps.
Is that, I want to make sure I'm not making things up, is that a through line in your life where, you're in Wisconsin, you have this sense of California, and you are in a car, you're like you're there, you're like following this intuition, and then you're surrounded by veterans, you're talking to people, you do your research, and like I'm in, like, it seems like two instances of some sort of intuition, a radical decision, and you're like 100% in and moved before people even have wrapped their head around the concept. Is that kind of consistent with Brown and Bain and SV?
Yeah.
Like, is that kind of a consistent trait?
Yeah, Justin, I actually got goosebumps right now, because my wife would tell you that I'm the most impatient person in the world. And I think it's really just a vestige of what you just described. And quite honestly, talking about it, I'm kind of coming to terms with it. Yeah, that is a pattern, which is identifying something that I want and attacking it full speed. And there's nothing else on my mind. It consumes me, for better or worse. And and when I say consumes me, I mean consumes my thoughts, consumes my actions. I'm researching everything there's to research about it. I dream about it. I think about it all the time. and it comes true. It's wild, and I've every single major event in my life has been this way, and it sounds absurd, really, to say like I'm just thinking about it and it comes true. But I know now, I'm 31 years old. I'm so used to this feeling that it's almost like a superpower, if you will. It's if I want something bad enough, I just wait for it to consume me, and it comes true. And so yeah, the idea of moving to California, the idea of the Marine Corps, the idea of like being the best Marine in my boot camp platoon, so on and so forth. The idea of getting out and going to school and like I'm going to go to this school, or I'm going to get this job. That's exactly how it's happened, and it happens really, really fast. But in my mind, it feels normal. But my wife would, for example, again, would consider it impatient or way too fast. But not to derail it, but I'm a fan of Wisconsin sports teams, and the Milwaukee Bucks won the championship a couple of years ago. And there's this moment where Giannis Antetokounmpo, our all-star, he just won the championship, and you see him sitting on one of the chairs, the confetti's falling, and he just sort of soaks it all in. And maybe 30 seconds, he's sitting there absorbing it. And I could relate to him. It was, he wanted this, he went out and he got it, and he basks in the glory for about 30 seconds. And then they finally interview him and they say, Giannis, congratulations. How do you feel? What are you going to do? He said, I'm ready to win another one. Let's go do it again. Right. And a lot of people would say, slow down, enjoy the moment, right? Be a little more mindful. And he did that. It was just his scale of that is so short. And that I could relate to it. I remember watching that and just feeling, a deep sense of semblance. And I think it's the same thing. It's, I'm going to go join the Marine Corps, or I'm going to move to California, or I'm going to go to Brown, right? And the decision was really quick, but I was very sure in it. And to this day, it is my how I operate, if you will.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's a different level of wisdom to be able to trust your instincts. And I don't view it, from the little bits I know of you, and I've seen this before. It's like not rash. It's 1-3-7 thinking, where it feels like you're skipping ahead, but it's like you're moving very quickly mentally, but you're also, the story that you told us about San Diego is you're running into veterans everywhere. You're meeting people. So it's not like you moved there and you went to the recruiter, like you had your 50 tabs open. You're very quickly processing. It seems like a very quick processing of information, but also a very healthy connection to intuition and a healthy self-trust to follow that intuition. And like those three things in tandem are really a force to be reckoned with. I'm curious, I want to talk about life post Marines, but one thing I'd love to hear about is when I think about my experience in the military, I think of exposure to a lot of people with different backgrounds. I think of a complete lack of control over most of my life. I think of moving around frequently, and we could kind of continue on these things, but those are three things that I associate with par for the course growing up. Like you didn't have control over things. You were exposed to a lot of different things. And I'm just kind of curious, like, do you feel like your background in hindsight kind of prepared you in a way for what life was like in the Marines?
Yeah, totally. 100%. It was everything that I desired, which was, I guess you could see it as a similar circumstance or an extension of what I was used to, right? Lack of control, ambiguity at certain times. But I actually thought of it more of for the first time almost ever, I had my basic requirements met, meaning I had food, shelter, blah, 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 but also a sense of true camaraderie. A family, if you will, that I could identify with. And then there was the piece of the value of merit. And I could go as far as I wanted to go or do what I wanted to do, obviously within the needs of the Marine Corps is sort of the phrase, right? It's all based on the needs of the Marine Corps. But if you're good enough and you're, excuse my language, a shit hot Marine, you can, the world is your oyster. And for me, that was all I needed to thrive. Again, I had my basic needs met. I have an outlet for aggression or frustration with life. I have a fraternity of brothers and sisters around me, and I'm able to use my God-given ability to succeed. It was exactly what I wanted. So yeah, I think it was a great sort of natural progression, and made sense for me almost instantaneously. Again, within a couple of days of doing my research, saying, yeah, this is what I want. And I'm sure I could feel the same about some of the other branches, but for whatever reason, the Marine Corps in particular stood out to me.
And I'm assuming, did you go straight from the Marines to Brown?
No, so I got out of the Marine Corps, and I got out because I wanted to go to school. I was very much on the fence of whether or not I was going to reenlist. At times I thought I was going to be a Marine, sort of make a career out of it. But then the reality of the Marine Corps life sets in. It's like, I actually don't know if this is what I want to do forever. When I was overseas, I actually spent some time with a couple of counterintelligence Marines away from my unit. Long story short, I was escorting a Marine, and who had to go get some medical care in Europe. But I got sort of attached to these two counterintelligence Marines, and they were wearing civilian clothes. And I remember just following them around the Middle East. We got to ride around in like a private, a civilian car, a Land Rover through the Kuwaiti desert, and got to visit a couple of different safe houses that we had set up. It was just a fascinating and wildly different Marine Corps experience, to the point where I thought, okay, I want to do this. And they had sort of encouraged me to consider doing a lateral move. So that was on my mind. I also had unit commander saying, hey, based off your records and your ASVAB score, you should consider doing the Marine Corps version of like the enlisted to officer program. At the time it was called MECEP. So I had a couple of different options when it came down to the end of my first enlistment. But the idea of school and education was, I dropped out the first time, but it wasn't I'll see you later, I'm never going to do this again, because I knew that one, I was just very intellectually curious, and there was, not that you don't learn in the Marine Corps, but there was certain, like I was bookish, and I wanted to experience a classroom and actually sort of be in that academic environment. And I also saw, again, going back to this idea of what I don't want, I knew that I wanted to have a bit of money and to afford a certain lifestyle, because I didn't want the opposite of that. And so the idea of school just sort of, again, made sense for all of those reasons. And I was talking to my wife about this. I was in Djibouti, Africa at the time. I was talking to her on a sat phone, and I had to make a decision soon about my reenlistment or not. And she sort of used a very simple logic, which was, you can reenlist now. And if you know that you want to go to school, again, I'm very decisive, and it's like, I'm going to go to school. It's just a matter of when. If maybe you should get out now and go to school, because it seems like the odds of you returning after another 4-year contract or another 4-year increment, the odds each contract diminish, right? And it's true based off what I've seen. Before you know it, you're 12, 16 years in, it's like, well, I might as well retire. And then it's like, are you going to go to school at 45? And it can be done. But anyway, so that was the idea. And if I wanted to, I could always go back in. I could go back in as an officer. I could do the lateral move, or I don't have to. And so I made the decision to get out. My wife had just graduated from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. We moved her out to California, and the idea was we were going to live in California, put down roots. And so to answer your question, I go straight to Brown. No, I got out. I enrolled in a local community college in Orange County, California. And the plan was, it's actually a great system, at least in California. The community college to the 4-year institution pipeline is very well defined. And so I was going to spend the time at the community college, save a lot of money, and then transfer to one of the UCs. And I was thinking UCLA or UC Berkeley. And then I stumbled across Service to School, which I know that you're somewhat familiar with, and got paired up with an ambassador, a mentor, if you will, who was also a former foster child. He was an Air Force vet, and he went to Yale. And he said, you should you should consider applying to some of these schools out here in New England. And that, talk about the power of that program, of that organization. It's literally, that's where the magic is. It's in another vet telling, another vet, hey, you're good enough. If I can make it here, you should certainly try. And so that's, again, this mindset comes in. I think within a week of doing my research, it was, okay, I'm going to apply to these schools, and I want to go to Brown. And I bought a ticket and toured New England and went to all the schools that I was planning to apply to. And in the end, Brown was the one that I wanted the most. And sure enough, I got into it and got into a couple of the other ones too. And this is the one that I've been thinking about continuously, and it happened. And so, yeah, I think between getting out and starting at Brown was about 18 months to 2 years. I got out in 2015 and enrolled in 2016 at Brown.
What was your experience as a student? I mean, obviously you're there's probably not a cell in your body that was the same as when you were a student in Wisconsin, but I'm just curious, what was the comparison of that experience after serving, after being out for a little bit, and then now you're back? I just picture you as this tiger amidst, you could do some damage. You've got direction. You probably know yourself so much more. You're knowing what you're wanting rather than the typical 18-year-old who's kind of on their own for the first time.
Yeah. So I can compare 18-year-old Michael to post Marine Corps Michael, because there's a whole other can of worms, which is, what is it like to be a Marine Corps veteran at a place like Brown University? But the former question is, it was a night and day experience, particularly of course, right? We always talk about the discipline you learn in the military, and it's true, right? We all say it for a reason. I went from being an 18-year-old kid who, maybe was smart to a certain extent, but didn't have the discipline or really the desire to sit down in a classroom and listen to what was being taught, versus I was on a mission. It was once I got to Brown, this is an incredible privilege, an incredible opportunity that nobody in my hometown goes to a school like Brown. I'll tell you that much. And it was not lost on me that this was a privilege. And again, thinking of the idea of upward mobility, I knew right away, but just by seeing and interacting with the students I went to school with, that this was an entirely different world of American society with an entirely different rule set, and the opportunities are completely different. And so I wasn't there to mess around, right? I was there to learn, and to set myself and my family up for success. So it felt very mission oriented, and not to minimize the idea of absorbing just knowledge and the joy of learning and what it's like to sit in a classroom. I appreciate all of that too, but there was an end game. And I don't know what I was looking for in terms of a career, but I knew I was going to leverage this to do right by my family and set us up for success. And so, yeah, I was the student that was always 15 minutes early, especially at first, and then maybe it was 5 minutes early. And I sat in the front row of every class, just about. I didn't live on campus. I had a wife, right? So we lived off campus about a mile away, but I didn't have a lot of the normal student experience outside of the classroom, right? The dorm parties and things like that. Though, to my defense, I did go to University of Wisconsin for a while and grew up not too far from there. So I knew what it was like to be at a party school. I had done that. And then Marines, right? We know how to have fun. So again, at Brown, it was like, I'm not there to do keg stands and party or, go to frat parties. It's like, I'm there to learn. And it was an awesome experience from an academic perspective.
I love that. I think the thing that you said that really stuck with me is this sense of being in an environment with a completely different rule set and completely different opportunities. And I think when we first met, that was, I couldn't have articulated at the time, but that's like the thing that's so intriguing about your story and the type of story you represent is like, how does someone who grows up outside of a very structured, what I view as a very structured system, even though we don't recognize it, that has certain rules and norms and etiquettes and networks and connections and all of these things, how on earth does an outsider break into that
Yeah.
and not only break into it, but thrive. It's like the learning curve there for me is like very hard to get my head around,
Yeah.
because the things that I took for granted growing up in a 2-parent household, like all of these things play a role in that. And so I think it's just wild, and it increases my admiration for your story that you're able to enter into that and understand the rules, and like, not, I mean, it's just not even like become like bitter at the unbelievable, what I would view as an injustice of the system, but you're able to be
Mhm.
like, all right, new
Yeah.
rules.
Yeah.
I'm in it. This is what I'm doing. It's like, it's an incredible amount of shifting gears in what I imagine is a very short amount of time.
Yeah, I had a mentor. I have a mentor, and we met through. I actually think it was one of the co-founders of Service to School put us in touch. But he was an old Brown alum. He wasn't a vet, but he wanted to help vets. And long story short, we got put in touch. And he's a pretty successful, wealthy person, older person, and lives on the West Coast with his family. And at one point when I was at Brown, he flew me out to California and, showed me around the Bay Area and just, took care of me for a weekend. It was fun. It was great. But it was a completely different world. We're talking about a very wealthy person. And I had never experienced that. And at one point we went to like a social club that he was a member of, and it was very hoity toity. And there's a very nice dinner with wait staff and things like that. And I'm speaking to all of his friends, all of his buddies. And at one point he leans over and he's like, "How do you know how to do this?" And it's your question, right? Or to your observation, which is not coming from this world, and being able to do that in a quick amount of time. And I didn't even have a good answer for him. I said, "I don't know. I really don't know. It's just natural." But I think now I've come to appreciate the fact that, for better or worse, my childhood, constantly moving around, constantly shifting, the norms and the rules by which you play are changing, and the ability to identify personality types and how understand who's in charge and just the social dynamics at a short amount of time was necessary in order to survive sometimes, quite frankly. And so I think that has a lot to do with it, right? And, and it also maybe connects to this idea of knowing something very quickly, what my wife would say is an impatient amount of time. I think it, again, might be a vestige or an artifact of growing up on the streets. So yeah, maybe I don't come from that world, but I'm really good at adapting in a short amount of time. That's the name of the game. And I say game not unintentionally. It does sometimes feel like a game. It's like, oh, this is a new environment. Let me figure it out and figure out how to adapt and blend in. And then once I'm comfortable, then I can, operate as who I am. And I don't mean it to sound like I'm fake, but there's an element of code switching, if you will. And it's been vital to my success for sure.
I love that. I'm cognizant there's not a lot of time left.
Yeah.
And there's a million questions. I would love I'm trusting this is not the last conversation, but I always want to leave one question open-ended, which is like, I've asked the questions that my curiosity led me to, but knowing you have people listening to this show who are men in the military or veterans, or maybe not, just a fan of the military community, what else would you want to share with them? Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to make sure you say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think I would use the time and the platform to stress the importance of military folks, veterans, going to school. And this is probably more directed towards the enlisted group. But I think our country and our society, we have what some would call the civilian military divide. Meaning there are a number of people that have served and worn the uniform, but they're typically not in decision-making positions post-service, right? And this is very different than, let's say, World War II, when everybody came back home, and for the couple of decades after, the highest echelons of government or business were filled with men and women who had served, and I think that was super important. That is no longer the case. And so I would just plead for all, again, probably more for the enlisted side, but for all vets, demand a seat at the table in terms of higher education, show up, graduate and insert yourselves back into our country in a different way, because we need your leadership. And I think our society would be that much better for having this really intimate relationship with service members and people who end up, whether it's leading business or institutions or halls of government. And part of this comes from the idea that I went to Brown and fully understood that the students I learned with, their parents sent them there, and the university their mission was to churn out the next global leaders. And I realized right away that includes, I could be sitting in class with the next president, and if there's not any veteran presence or military understanding or knowledge in general, what a missed opportunity. And so one of my missions has been and continues to be to inspire vets to go back to school, sit next to that former president, maybe hang out with her and help her understand that when the time comes and she's making foreign policy decisions, for example, she'll remember that young Marine that sat next to her in class. So I could talk about that all day, but that's what I'd use this time to mention.
Love it, man. I wish we had twice the time that we do, but just really appreciate your honesty and transparency and introspection and determination, and just the role model you are for so many people. And I just feel it's just amazing to think of how many people had so much in their favor that have not achieved what you do. And I just really respect the dedication, drive, and I guess humility too, to just swing for the fences and be, like you mentioned, mentors along the way. I know there's so much we didn't get into, but clearly you're someone who is hungry to learn and open to feedback and trusting yourself. There's this really incredible blend of very rare traits that you've combined really gracefully, that the story I have is that's enabled your success. But I just want to underscore for myself and for our audience, just to think of I just keep on putting myself in your shoes. And I'm like, dude, I don't end up at Brown if I'm dealt the cards you were dealt. I end up like most people would end up in that situation through no fault, no judgment. And just really appreciate your sharing your story with me and our audience.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. It's I appreciate the compliments and the opportunity to share the story. And I would say in this short amount of time, it's a really interesting exercise to self-reflect and think of that story from start to end. So thank you for the opportunity. I actually feel like I was able to put words more to my experiences. So thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And for listeners, I'll link to Michael's LinkedIn profile on the show notes, and keep your eyes on his story, because I think this story is just at the start, and I think there's great things ahead, and great to capture you at this chapter, putting the pieces together. But I know there's a lot more in store.
That's right. Thanks, Justin. I appreciate it.